I suspect a lot of people here either write code or want to write code for a living or create documents or other kinds of pieces of knowledge work, right? How many people would like to be like 50% more productive? Anybody? 50% more? Yeah. I mean, it's an obvious question, right? The answer is clearly yes. I would argue that the latest generation of machine learning tools that are coming towards us pretty rapidly are going to afford us all at least that level of productivity increase, if not more, which is both awesome and kind of terrifying. So today I want to essentially present that argument. And I'm first going to talk about the importance of the adoption of these kinds of tech, machine learning, artificial intelligence, data science, and so forth for organizations. I'm going to speed run through that. I have a background in machine learning and a background in machine learning operations. I'm not an expert in that, but what I do is I build teams that field those kinds of solutions. So I'm going to speed run through what does that look like. It's different than normal and traditional software development. And then I want to talk about what does it look like for an individual to take on the use of that technology, and how could you as a person get that increase in performance, and why should you probably seek to do that, right? Because other people will. So start with kind of an overview here, 3 main points. Businesses and organizations are always going to seek to use high leverage technology to compete in their landscape, right? They're going to use serverless technology. That's a big thing that's what companies moving towards now. They're going to use machine learning. A lot of companies are moving towards that now. Obviously, before that, it was we're going to move to the cloud. We're going to move to AWS. We're going to move to those kinds of platforms. Before that, it was we're going to adopt things like Ruby on Rails or higher abstractions in programming, right? Moving from assembly to, all the way to Python, right? That's a pretty big jump, but that's more leverage into technology. The technology today is machine learning, data science, AI. Those are the most high leverage technologies that are now emerging, and we'll talk about why in a minute. I argue that as companies have a need to adopt that technology to remain competitive, to build competitive advantage, individuals should be looking at this as well. The people here in this talk, for example. So starting with the notion of companies wanting to adopt this. This is a pretty wordy quote from a book called Competing in the Age of AI. And what I want to just to highlight in this quote is this part that I underline here, this notion that as companies adopt new technology, they have to reconsider how they operate as a business. They can't just sprinkle AI and ML over their business and hope that they're going to achieve great results. They actually have to reconsider their operating models. They have to reconsider how they actually do business. And you have to think of it pretty deeply if you're going to achieve the kinds of outcomes that a lot of organizations are currently achieving in terms of massive competitive advantage. I'm going to extend that and to say humans, we knowledge workers need to rethink the way we work as well. And I'll show some examples at the end of the presentation for that. So consider competing in the age of AI. Here's a fun little diagram about this. This book is really great. I recommend everybody take a look at it. I might ignore the words on the left because I don't have enough time to kind of go through them in detail. But the big point of this slide is the graph on the right. Digital operating models take advantage of the latest and greatest kinds of tech out in industry. That includes machine learning. And what we find with digital operating models is that the more users you have, network effects happen. Metcalfe's law applies. More users, more data. When you begin to use AI and ML against that data, you can get greater insights, greater competitive advantage. You can create more value in your space. I think a lot of people, this is like kind of a no-brainer at this point. We've probably all observed this. Well, the same thing is true for us as individuals. We can begin to take advantage of these same models that are now really being released and have been released over the last couple of years. Contrast that with this other gray line, the traditional operating model, which is diminishing returns in business. The more people you support, the more companies the more customers you have, the harder it is to make that next incremental dollar. Digital operating models flip that on its head. The more data you have, the more users you have, the more value you can create, and the more competitive advantage you can create. Is everybody tracking this so far? Pretty straightforward, cool. I think a really great example of this that comes from this book is there's a company in China called Ant Financial. Ant Financial has 1.2 billion customers. They support that 1.2 billion customers with 1,500 employees. a number, like many of you who've worked in the industry have a sense of how unbelievable that is, right? 1.2 billion customers on the back of 1,500 employees is gigantic leverage. They do that because they centered the organization around AI and ML. It's infused in everything they do, and they've organized around being able to create what is referred to as the AI factory. This idea of you want to have a data pipeline where you're constantly pulling in new data from your organization. You're creating what some people in industry refer to as a digital twin of your organization. And from that, you're then running experiments to build algorithms that are going to help you unlock value out of that data stream. An example of this was back when I worked at SendGrid. We'd send about 1 billion emails a day. And out of that email stream, we would seek to classify that mail as phish or spam because we didn't want to send it. We created a pipeline to pull all those signals in, run experiments, and then use that to create value in the form of, we're not going to pollute the email ecosystem with phish and spam. We created this pipeline. This is, all companies in the future are going to have this at their center of their organization, how they do this. This is going to be a key thing. Many organizations, it already is. Many organizations, frankly, resist this, but it's going to be really important. And I argue a similar mindset is applicable to us as knowledge workers. So I have a hypothesis here. Just as companies can create unassailable competitive advantage from adopting AI and ML, professionals, hobbyists, and people generally will also see massive benefits. So here's an example of that. This was from a conference that actually was last week. Microsoft did their Ignite conference. And in that conference, they were talking about the results they're seeing from GitHub Copilot. What? Okay. GitHub Copilot, for those users who use it and use it effectively, 40% of the code they write gets written by GitHub, their Copilot. Now, this isn't the fanciest code. This is boilerplate code, pretty straightforward code, but we're still pretty early days with this technology. Second, this is where that 50% number comes in. 55% people who use GitHub Copilot to say, write a web server in JavaScript could do so 55% faster using that technology, which is pretty wild. There's lots of examples of this kind of technology that are applicable to software developers, people who are writing books, articles, blog posts, and so forth. This is all really starting to come out. Many of you probably have seen ads for Grammarly. There's another one called Quillbot. There's Write Sonic. In the code generation space, there's GitHub Copilot. There's Codex, which is the version that Microsoft is starting to internally use, which is pretty phenomenal. And then there's lots of AI generation tools that help crack the nut. And Morgan's going to show some of this in a minute on art generation, right? The creation of novel art, graphics, images, and so forth. And we're going to see the infusion of all of this tech in all of our tools as we go forward. It's going to be pretty wild, and it's going to result in some of these amazing productivity improvements. And I would argue you should start today. Now, a couple of points. This technology is moving really fast. So there's like not time to waste here. OpenAI's GPT-3 model is one of the main underlying models that a lot of these companies are using as a sort of engine that they're training, or fine-tuning is the term, such that they can actually create these amazing results. These models are growing very, very rapidly. This diagram on the right side demonstrates the rate of growth of the size of these models, which is roughly analogous to the power of these models. There's plenty of debate about that in terms of, do you create bigger models that create more power? There's lots of debate there, but generally speaking, the short answer is yes. So this is a logarithmic scale, right? So as you can see, I mean, it's just growing. It's doubling about every 10 months, which is just an incredible rate of growth in terms of the size of these models and the power. The amount of money that's being poured into this space is obviously incredible as well, and maps to this kind of growth rate. So what's that mean in terms of what we can all use? Well, I've spent a bunch of time playing with GPT-3. I've spent a bunch of time playing with the AI art generation tools, but GPT-3 has really captured my attention. And I would suggest all of you go play with it as well to get a feel for what these kinds of systems can do. I'm going to speed run through this section because I'm pretty sure I'm running low on time. But this next couple of slides really talks about what is referred to as prompt engineering. Prompt engineering is important for the AI art space. I suspect Morgan will talk about that, but it's also really key and how you leverage models like GPT-3. There are three main steps to writing a good prompt. Actually, it's more than three as I think about it. Like all good engineering problems, you want to define the problem you're trying to solve, be really clear about that. You want to ask yourself, and this is a bit of a nuance on the art of using this system, is there a way for you to properly define a prompt so you can get the answer back in one shot? That's very efficient and very cost effective. You can also do things like fine tuning a model, which allows you to really tweak the inputs and the outputs of what you're putting into the GPT-3 prompt. That's really powerful too. I've seen a number of people fine tune models, and a lot of the products that have been rolled out use fine tuning to really create fantastic output, but you don't necessarily need to do that, as you'll see in a second. Some technical pieces of information: when you go into GPT-3's playground, there are some specific parameters that you can tune. I won't ruminate on this too long, but know that you should, if you're going to play with this, learn a bit about what these mean and how they work. So talking about what can the system do. This slide is talking about just an experiment I was running. I ran across somebody on Twitter who said that, hey, did you know GPT-3 can actually create diagrams? So you can actually say, model the relationship between different entities in what it knows about in its knowledge graph. Well, I asked it, hey, draw me some diagrams of the major powers during World War II. So it drew a graph viz, it emitted text, a bunch of tokens that are the graph viz diagram of this. I went and used an off-the-shelf tool and drew these little diagrams. That seems pretty boring, but pretty amazing that it understands and is inside the knowledge of GPT-3 is what happened in World War II and the different alliances and the different timelines. Now, okay, now if you're thinking, yeah, okay, but how is that maybe useful for me? Well, how many people have watched like Game of Thrones? There's a lot of characters in Game of Thrones, right? Like it's super complicated, it's really hard to follow. So it turns out GPT-3 also knows about Game of Thrones. And all of this is obviously impossible to read, but I had it in its knowledge, it knows, it's absorbed this probably from a Wikipedia page that some incredibly obsessed people wrote, all the characters, all the relationships, all of that, right? And it drew this graph, one shot, one prompt. The prompt was draw all of the alliances of the book Game of Thrones, draw me a diagram. It did it. Now, it didn't do it perfectly on the first try. This is like several tries, right? But if you think about what this means, right? What are the consequences of the fact that it can do this with this body of information? It can do this with many, many other bodies of information as well that are embedded in the model. Because keep in mind, what the OpenAI team did is they scraped most of the text of the internet and fed it into this model, which is both kind of awesome and kind of terrifying at the same time, because it's going to have a lot of bias and there's going to be a bunch of messed up stuff in there potentially. So take all of this with a grain of salt, right? Like, don't assume this is all 100% correct, right? Don't go build medical devices on the back of this technology, not yet. But there's a lot of really interesting things you can do with this, and I encourage you all to go just play with it. You can go get an account for free, and you can play with these prompts. How about doing some research? So I wrote a prompt. This is a one-shot prompt to allow me to basically swap out some concept, right? Or some substance, right? So I recently started looking at berberine as like a supplement maybe I want to take to help with my insulin resistance, right? Well, this turns research on its head. You could have it write you an article, and then you could go and say, I want to go now find and confirm the facts in this article that I could then use to say, okay, this is how I would make a judgment about whether or not I want to actually take the supplement or whatever. But you could replace berberine with calculus. You could replace it with kind of like anything, and it will write you an article. And it will also give you the references for what's in that article. That requires some pretty clever prompt engineering to get it to do that well, but it's possible. Okay, how am I using this, right? Now, one of my jobs is I build high performance teams for SaaS companies, hire lots of people. A big thing that I run into is the need to generate high quality questions when I'm interviewing people. This may be useful for you all. If you were thinking about getting jobs, you might want to generate some questions that might come towards you based upon your resume. Well, it turns out GPT-3 with some clever prompts can do that. So this is my resume. You can't see the top of it. It's not important, but it generates questions based upon different values that I think are important in an organization: integrity, courage, compassion. It takes what's in my resume, it takes its understanding and knowledge about those concepts, combines them together and writes questions. That's hard for me to do well. It does it pretty well. And this is just the prompt, no fine tuning, just out of the box. So this is one of the ways that I'm using this. Yeah. Yep. That's it. Questions?
How might you suggest for someone who may not have ever, interacted with some of this technology to sort of get a grasp of what they can do for themselves?
Sure. There's probably a couple of answers to that question. The first is, in this, there's a whole bunch of links that you can go and look at examples of how people are using this technology. There's a bunch of blog posts, obviously. There's some fantastic analysis. There's some products that are being used, like this Lit RPG. I play tabletop RPG games. And this company has used GPT-3 on the back end to generate adventures, maps, monsters, NPCs. It's quite phenomenal. This guy, David Shapiro, he's created all sorts of videos online where he walks through how does he use GPT-3 to write a novel, right? All sorts of fun tools. So I would say go spend some time poking around at some of these links, and then just go play with it. Like, the thing that I found is just it's just a fun tool to play with. Like, super compelling, super interesting. You're like, could it do this? Yeah. Could it do that? Turns out it can write code, it can do analysis, it knows things about the world. It's pretty darn cool.